If you think the story of the Lord of the Rings has fascinating characters, just wait until you meet Fëanor. Few names in Middle-earth carry as much grandeur and tragedy as his, but the big question is, was he a misunderstood hero, a tragic anti-hero, or an outright villain? Some see him as a genius who defied gods, forged immortal artifacts, and fought valiantly for what was rightfully his. Others see nothing but a leader blinded by pride, responsible for betrayals, massacres, and the ruin of his own descendants. And the scariest part? Perhaps both are right. Fëanor was not just an extraordinary elf. He was a force of nature, creator of the legendary Silmarils, a master of art and warfare, and the one behind one of the greatest oaths ever made in Middle-earth. But he was also the architect of his own destruction, leading the Noldor down a path of no return. He defied the gods themselves, burned bridges and ships, and sealed his fate in flames. His choices impacted entire generations and shaped events that much later even led to Frodo's journey and the One Ring. But what is the truth about Fëanor? Was he a martyr, a victim of circumstances beyond his control, or the archetype of a leader consumed by his own pride? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning, to the birth of an elf who never took no for an answer, and who created the most beautiful and dangerous thing in Middle-earth. Fëanor is one of those characters who defies any attempt to box him into a simple label. He wasn't a classic hero, nor a caricatured villain. He was a raw force of nature, shaped by his genius and impulsiveness. Even as a character in The Lord of the Rings, who never crossed paths with Frodo or Aragorn, his presence still reverberated throughout Middle-earth. Tolkien created him as a being as grand as he was tragic, someone whose passions molded the fate of both elves and men. And the truth is, the more you study him, the more you realize he can't be reduced to right or wrong. He didn't just create, he transformed everything he touched. His intellect knew no bounds, and his pride was equally limitless. If there were an archetype for the misunderstood genius, Fëanor would be the original mold. Humanity knows figures like that. Think of Nikola Tesla, whose inventions defied the understanding of his time, yet whose temperament kept him from receiving recognition in his lifetime. Like Tesla, Fëanor saw what no one else did, but his vision was accompanied by a burning pride that prevented him from backing down, even in the face of destruction. His triumphs and failures intertwined like an epic poem. He possessed the passion of an artist and the stubbornness of a king who wouldn't be questioned. It was as if his very existence was a challenge to fate. Perhaps that's what fascinates us so much about him, the ability to embody the best and worst of what it means to be truly great. A misstep on his part wasn't just a stumble, it was a catastrophe on a historical scale. And at the same time, his brilliance elevated his people to heights never before seen. This duality is what makes Fëanor so fascinating. He was the one who created light and could extinguish it with the same breath. If he lived today, he might be one of those revolutionary visionaries who change the world, but also make plenty of enemies along the way. Like so many great leaders, his downfall was a direct reflection of his greatest qualities. The question remains, if he had been more moderate, would he have been able to achieve everything he did? But Fëanor didn't know the middle ground. He lived at the extreme end of passion and anger, of genius and destruction. And his legacy, as we shall see, was not just one of creation, but also of tragedy. Because when someone so powerful decides to fight for what he considers his, the entire world feels the impact. And it all starts with something he created, something that shone like nothing else ever had in Middle-earth. Fëanor was not just a talented elf, he was the brightest craftsman ever to walk Middle-earth. His mind worked like a blazing forge, constantly refining, shaping, and creating the impossible. If the Lord of the Rings shows us powerful artifacts like the Rings of Power, it's important to remember that long before Sauron existed as a craftsman of evil, Fëanor had already elevated the art of creation to divine levels. The invention of Tengwar, the elven writing system, is proof of his obsession with improvement. He wasn't just refining, he was reinventing. If you've ever held a Tolkien book and admired those stylized elven letters, know that you owe it to Fëanor. His restless mind not only created new ways to record knowledge, but also expanded the very possibilities of communication. In practice, he did for the elves what Gutenberg did for humanity when he invented the movable type press. He made knowledge more accessible, more efficient, and of course, more beautiful. Imagine living in an era when symbols were rudimentary, and suddenly someone creates a calligraphy so sophisticated that it becomes the standard for generations. That was Fëanor. But he didn't stop there. He also forged the Palantiri, those seeing stones that allowed communication and spying over long distances. If the humans of Middle-earth had a modern equivalent, it might be the invention of the internet. Yet even something as practical as the Palantiri couldn't compare to his greatest creation, the Silmarils. 3 jewels that were not mere adornments, but crystallized fragments of the sacred light of the 2 trees of Valinor. If the Rings of Power were made to corrupt and control, the Silmarils were pure celestial essence. The problem? Something so beautiful never goes unnoticed. Just like in the real world, where brilliant inventions often spark greed and conflict, the Silmarils were no exception. They were so unique, so perfect, that even the gods desired to possess them. And that's when things started to get complicated. Creating something incredible is one thing, but keeping it out of the wrong hands, that's an entirely different battle. And it was exactly this battle that began to consume Fëanor. Because when something you created becomes bigger than yourself, it doesn't just define you, it enslaves you. And in his case, that obsession only grew, fueled by a void that had been with him since birth. Fëanor was born, shrouded in a light that shone brighter than any other elf's, but that light came at a high price. His mother, Míriel, was consumed by the very act of bringing him into the world, as if all her essence had been drained to give rise to someone who would change Middle-earth's destiny. Imagine a birth so intense that the mother herself chooses not to go on living. It's almost a harbinger of the kind of existence this elf would have. It's no wonder Fëanor grew up carrying an insatiable restlessness, a void in his chest that no achievement could ever fill. The absence of a maternal figure shaped his personality in a brutal way. While other elves grew up surrounded by love and balance, Fëanor had to find his strength on his own. It was as if he was born already having to prove something to the world. How many people do you know who, having not received enough affection, in childhood grew up with an almost compulsive need to be the best at everything? That was Fëanor's curse, and at the same time, his greatness. His father, Finwë, tried to compensate for this loss with dedication and love, but there were limits to what a father could offer without the gentle touch of a mother to balance things out. When Finwë remarried and had other children, Fëanor felt that his place in the world was threatened. How could someone born with a tragic destiny accept having to share his inheritance with half-siblings? His pride became a shield, and his genius a way to prove that no one could ever replace him in his father's heart or in the annals of elven history. That feeling of loss, that sense of being incomplete, drove Fëanor to seek perfection. Every invention, every magnificent creation of his, was an attempt to fill a void that could never be completely healed. He didn't just want to be great. He had to be. He needed his name to be remembered, his mark indelible, his existence to mean something. But when you obsessively search for meaning, you often end up losing yourself along the way. And Fëanor was only just beginning to lose himself. His heart, restless since birth, became a fertile ground for manipulation, for a spirit so fiery and impulsive without someone to temper it can easily become a target. And that's exactly what happened when Morgoth entered the scene. Fëanor was never a leader who sought consensus. He was the kind who inspired both admiration and fear in equal measure, the type of person you follow for his brilliance, but fear for his temper. If there's one thing Tolkien made sure to show, in The Lord of the Rings and in Middle-earth's mythology, it's that the greatest leaders aren't always the fairest, and Fëanor was the embodiment of that dilemma. To some, he was a misunderstood visionary, someone who fought for what was his against overwhelming forces. To others, he was a reckless, arrogant man who doomed his people to endless tragedy. What makes Fëanor so hard to classify is that he was right about many of his concerns. He perceived hidden threats where others saw only peace. He understood that Morgoth was no ordinary enemy, that the Valar didn't always protect the elves as promised. But instead of rallying allies, he pushed away anyone who even slightly disagreed with his vision. How many leaders in history have made the same mistake? Napoleon, perhaps? Visionary, brilliant, but so stubborn that he ended up isolated and defeated by his own obstinacy. His temperament made him unpredictable. He could be the inspiration for a golden age or the catalyst for a devastating war. And it's precisely that contradiction that still sparks debate today. When we look at Fëanor, we're looking at the very duality of ambition. What happens when someone is right but loses their moral compass trying to prove it? He was the kind of leader who preferred to be feared rather than ignored, who believed his genius was enough to justify any act. And perhaps that's exactly why he fascinates us so much. After all, how many people in real life don't act the same way? How many geniuses have destroyed their own legacies because they couldn't know when to back down? Fëanor was not one to settle for half victory. He needed to win completely, and if that meant defying even the gods, he would do so without hesitation. The problem is that when you go up against forces much larger than yourself, the danger isn't just in the fight, it's in what you become along the way. And Fëanor hadn't yet realized that his greatest enemy wasn't Morgoth, nor the Valar, nor the kings who opposed him. His greatest enemy was himself. But that didn't stop him from being manipulated, because even the brightest can fall when their weakness is touched at just the right spot. Fëanor was a genius, but even the brightest can be blinded by their own pride. And if there's one thing Morgoth, the first and most powerful Lord of the Dark, knew how to do perfectly, it was planting seeds of discord in restless hearts. In The Lord of the Rings, we see Sauron using tactics of deceit and corruption to weaken kings and entire peoples. But it was with Fëanor that this strategy truly began. Morgoth didn't need dark magic to defeat him, just a subtle push in the right direction, and Fëanor would take care of the rest on his own. And what did Morgoth do? He touched on his greatest weakness, distrust and wounded pride. He whispered that the Valar wanted to keep him weak, that they envied his power, that his own people didn't value him enough. Who hasn't fallen into that trap? Who hasn't found themselves doubting everything after hearing the right words at the right time? That's the game of manipulation. You don't need to invent absurd lies, just distort inconvenient truths. And Fëanor, already inflamed by years of resentment, embraced these words without question. But what truly demonstrates Morgoth's power wasn't just manipulating Fëanor, it was doing so without anyone realizing it until it was too late. He made one of the greatest elves in history become his own enemy, breaking alliances, creating divisions, and burning any bridge that could lead him back to reason. Imagine a king so obsessed with protecting his throne that without realizing it, he opens the gates of his own fortress to the enemy. That's exactly what happened. Fëanor didn't see that he was dancing to the tune of someone far more dangerous than the Valar themselves. He saw only his mission, his pain, his revolt, and when someone believes they're fighting for a just cause, even the cruelest acts seem inevitable. That's the power of manipulation, making you think every decision is entirely your own, when, in reality, you're already ensnared in someone else's web. And so, the greatest craftsman of Middle-earth became the chief agent of chaos that Morgoth could ever desire. But there was more to come, because a heart inflamed by anger doesn't content itself with mere complaints. It needs to act. And that's how Fëanor took the first step in transforming Valinor, a realm of peace, into the stage for one of the most shocking events in elven history, the creation of the first weapons in a world that had never needed them. Valinor was a place of pure harmony, a kingdom where war was unthinkable. No elf had ever wielded a blade to harm another living being until Fëanor. His restless spirit, already inflamed by Morgoth's manipulations, began to see danger everywhere. And real danger demands a real defense, right? That's how he did the unthinkable. He forged the first weapons in a world where no one ever even considered needing them. It wasn't Sauron, it wasn't the orcs, it was an elf who brought the idea of battle to the paradise of the immortals. This is one of the most tragic turns in Middle-earth's history. Imagine living in a place where no one ever had to protect themselves, where trust and peace were absolute. Then suddenly someone comes along saying they want to take everything from us, and if we want to keep what's ours, we need to be ready to fight. This is the true birth of war paranoia, something that has repeated countless times in our own history. How many empires have fallen because they began preparing for wars that hadn't even happened yet? The problem is that weapons, once created, always find a use. They aren't locked away forever, and it's not just enemies that end up being hit by them. Fëanor might have believed his forge was a precaution, but in practice, he was setting a dangerous precedent. He was teaching the elves something they had never considered before, that perhaps strength was the answer, that maybe, instead of debating and negotiating, it was more effective to pick up a sword and take what you want. And that's how everything starts to unravel. Because once you teach someone that fighting can be a solution, sooner or later, that person will fight. And it didn't take long for Fëanor to take that mentality to the extreme. After all, what's easier, convincing your people to follow you peacefully or giving them an enemy to hate? He already saw his half-brothers as obstacles, the Valar as traitors, and the Teleri as weak. For someone gripped by paranoia, anyone can become a threat. And that mentality soon turned into action. For Fëanor, now armed and consumed by his fury, wasn't willing to wait for his enemies to come to him. He would strike first. And when a leader with his charisma and stubbornness swears an oath, his followers tend to follow him blindly, even when that oath brings irreversible consequences. Words carry weight, but some carry the weight of an entire destiny. When Fëanor and his sons swore to recover the Silmarils at any cost, they sealed what may be the most disastrous oath in Middle-earth's history. It wasn't an ordinary promise. It wasn't a mere vow of revenge. It was an unbreakable commitment, sealed not only by their will, but by fate itself. And when you swear something under the eyes of the gods, you can't turn back without paying a terrible price. The fact is, that oath wasn't just about the Silmarils. It was about pride, about domination, about the refusal to accept that something created by him could belong to someone else. He and his sons swore to pursue anyone who dared to claim the jewels, whether friend or foe. Anyone. Imagine how obsessive one must be to impose a curse on oneself and one's lineage, just to ensure that no one else touches what is considered theirs. In The Lord of the Rings, we see men and elves resisting the temptation of the rings of power, but the Silmarils were different. They weren't corrupted by sorcery. They were tainted by pure desire. And it was that obsession that began to consume everything around him. Fëanor no longer saw alliances. He no longer saw the greater good. He saw only the promise he had made. And as we have seen countless times in real-world history, leaders obsessed with a mission often sacrifice everything along the way: people, principles, even their own souls. Think of figures like Julius Caesar, who defied Rome for power, or modern political figures who make irreversible decisions just to keep a narrative intact. That was Fëanor, someone who preferred to destroy everything rather than admit he might be wrong. And the worst part of an oath like that is that it doesn't die with the one who made it. It becomes a dark legacy, a chain that binds the following generations. His sons carried that burden, and that one decision by Fëanor was enough to drag entire peoples into wars, betrayals, and massacres, because a vow so absolute leaves no room for mercy, for reconsideration. It demands blood, and blood Fëanor was willing to spill, starting with his own people. And that's how madness took shape. For to fulfill that oath, Fëanor was ready to do something no elf had ever done before. He would raise his sword against his own brothers. The line between hero and villain was never as thin as when Fëanor decided to shed elven blood. The kinslaying, or elf fratricide, was one of the most shocking acts in Middle-earth's history. Up to that point, elves had never fought each other in such a brutal manner. And who started this tragedy? The greatest craftsman of his race. Ironic, isn't it? The one who created the greatest beauty in elven history also ushered in the greatest calamity. In the name of the Silmarils, Fëanor led the massacre of the Teleri to forcibly seize their ships. It was obsession transformed into genocide. The Teleri weren't enemies. They weren't serving Morgoth, nor had they stolen anything from Fëanor. They simply refused to hand over their vessels, for the ships were as precious to them as the Silmarils were to Fëanor. But for someone consumed by his own fury, any refusal becomes an attack. And so, the elves of Valinor, who until then had lived in peace, turned against their own kin. Imagine a king so desperate for power that he would rather destroy his own people than accept a no for an answer. Any resemblance to tyrannical leaders in real history is no coincidence. The massacre wasn't just a battle, it was a moral rupture. It was a sign that Fëanor was no longer just a visionary leader. He had become a fanatic. When you believe your cause justifies any means, you've already crossed a dangerous line. In The Lord of the Rings, we see how Boromir tries to justify the use of the One Ring for the good of Gondor. But even he recognizes the error before it goes too far. Fëanor, on the other hand, had lost that restraint. He saw the Teleri only as obstacles, and obstacles are meant to be removed. The problem is that once you shed the first innocent blood, there's no turning back. The kinslaying stained the Noldor forever. Even those who only followed orders were cursed by the crime. Because when a leader drives his followers to such brutality, the guilt never rests solely on him. It spreads, corrupts, and destroys the collective spirit. The Noldor were never the same after that day, and worse, that was only the beginning. The kinslaying not only set a precedent, but sealed the fate of Fëanor's children. And the tragedy didn't end there. For even after seizing the ships, Fëanor wasn't satisfied. His ego wouldn't allow him to share his victory, and so the next step in his madness would be something that would change the fate of the Noldor forever. He would burn his own ships. Fëanor didn't just want to win, he wanted to make it clear that he needed no one. Forcibly taking the Teleri's ships was already a terrible crime, but what he did next transformed his arrogance into utter destruction. Instead of using the boats to lead all the Noldor to Middle-earth, he burned them, not out of necessity, not for strategy, but out of pure pride. He decided that only the warriors most loyal to him deserved to cross over, leaving behind those not willing to follow him blindly. A betrayal within his own rebellion. This scene is one of the most brutal in Middle-earth's history, and if you think about it, it echoes historical moments from our own world. How many times have leaders driven by ambition cut off their own alliances to prove a point? Alexander the Great burned his own ships to prevent his soldiers from retreating. Hernán Cortés did the same when conquering the Aztecs. But in Fëanor's case, it wasn't just a war strategy, it was a demonstration of power. He wanted to show that he made the rules, and that there was no room for the weak. And what happened to those left behind? They were stranded in Valinor, without ships, without a way to follow. Among them was Fingolfin, his very own half-brother, who until that moment still tried to believe that Fëanor had a worthy plan. This betrayal solidified the hatred among the Noldor. While Fëanor marched toward his personal war, those left behind had to face an impossible choice. Give up the mission or undertake an almost suicidal journey through the Helcaraxa, the fearsome icy passage at the far north. Burning the ships wasn't just a symbolic act of selfishness, it had devastating consequences. The Noldor split permanently, and those who survived the frozen crossing would never forgive Fëanor again. It was as if, at that moment, he had sealed his own fate. For when you betray your own people, no matter how noble your cause might be, your downfall becomes inevitable. The fire of the boats wasn't just flames devouring wood, it was Fëanor's destiny consuming itself before his eyes. But he didn't care. He was focused solely on his objective, vengeance against Morgoth. And like any leader driven purely by fury, he believed himself invincible. The problem? The real world doesn't work that way. And even the greatest flame can be extinguished when the right storm comes. If there was one thing Fëanor never failed at, it was courage. He wasn't the type to just talk, he acted. When he arrived in Middle-earth, he wasted no time with negotiations or defensive strategies. He charged straight into battle, facing Morgoth's armies as if his sheer fury could sweep away the darkness. And unbelievably, it worked. Fëanor and his followers crushed the initial enemy forces, scoring impressive victories. For a brief moment, it seemed his destructive impulse might indeed change the course of the war. This mentality is reminiscent of many military leaders who believed they were unstoppable. Alexander the Great conquered empires by fighting on the front lines. Napoleon turned Europe upside down with his speed and daring. But, as with any warrior who thinks himself invincible, Fëanor forgot one basic rule of war: recklessness comes at a price. He believed his genius and his fury were enough to face even Morgoth's direct servants. The problem? The enemy wasn't an ordinary army. His followers saw him as a god of war, someone who could lead them to final victory. But Fëanor was not invincible. He had forgotten that, no matter how powerful he was, Morgoth was a Vala, a being far beyond the comprehension of elves. The war wasn't just against orcs or lesser creatures. Morgoth had far more dangerous servants lurking on the horizon. And Fëanor's fate was already sealed. He just didn't know it yet. His mistake was confusing courage with recklessness. He thought that if he advanced fast enough, he could take Angband, Morgoth's fortress, on his own. Like someone who forgets there are limits, he went ahead of his soldiers, fearless, without hesitation. But every flame, no matter how bright, needs fuel, and Fëanor's was about to run out. He had won the first battles, but the war was far from over. And what happens when a warrior pushes too far without looking back? He finds himself surrounded, isolated, and at that moment, no matter how great your flame is, if the enemy is strong enough, it can be snuffed out with a single blow. Fëanor lived like a burning flame, and he died the same way, consumed by his own fire. His courage bordered on madness, and it was exactly that impulsiveness that sealed his fate. He charged alone against Angband, Morgoth's fortress, as if he could solve everything with the force of his fury. But no warrior, no matter how legendary, can challenge the Lord of the Dark alone and come out unscathed. And that's how he met his end, surrounded by the Balrogs, the fire demons that served Morgoth. This scene echoes many epic tragedies from real history. Think of heroes like Achilles, who believed themselves invincible until one single mistake brought them down, or leaders like Napoleon, who marched to destruction because they trusted too much in their own power. Fëanor was consumed by rage, convinced he could reach Morgoth and reclaim the Silmarils solely through brute force. But reality doesn't work that way. Against an enemy far greater, bravery without strategy is suicide. The Balrogs showed no mercy. They attacked him relentlessly, like flames devouring a piece of dry wood. Fëanor, even mortally wounded, did not yield. He fought until his last moment, refusing to retreat. Even when his body no longer responded, his fury burned on like a living curse. He didn't die as a mere warrior. He died as a symbol of his own obsession. His final look toward Angband wasn't one of fear, but of defiance, as if to say, "It isn't over yet." And that was the greatest irony of his death. He fell before even reaching Morgoth, before ever seeing the Silmarils again. He died without his vengeance, without seeing his oath fulfilled. Yet somehow it didn't matter, because his flame didn't die with his body. His legacy, his obsession, would continue to burn in the hearts of his children and followers. Fëanor's story didn't end with his death, for an oath like his doesn't vanish with time. It becomes a shadow, a force that drags those who followed him down the same path of destruction. And so, even after his death, Fëanor still dictated the fate of Middle-earth because his sons carried his curse, and they were willing to take it to its bitter end. Fëanor's death wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of an even greater tragedy. His oath did not die with him. On the contrary, his sons were bound to that cursed promise, doomed to pursue it until the bitter end. And that is what makes Fëanor one of the most tragic figures in Middle-earth. He didn't just destroy his own life, he dragged his entire lineage into ruin. Each of his sons inherited the curse to pursue the Silmarils at any cost, regardless of the consequences. And as we know, when you're willing to go to any lengths, disaster is only a matter of time. What makes it even more cruel is that none of Fëanor's children really had a choice. The oath wasn't just a symbolic promise. It was an unbreakable pact, a force that consumed them from within. It was like a self-imposed curse, a contract that could never be broken without terrible consequences. And so, generation after generation, Fëanor's name became synonymous with destruction, betrayal, and tragedy. His children fought, killed, and died for a goal that would never truly set them free. In The Lord of the Rings, we see how the kings of men are consumed by their desire for the rings of power. But Fëanor's sons were imprisoned by something even worse, an inherited obsession. Imagine growing up knowing that your mission in life isn't your choice, but a debt you must pay, no matter what it costs. How many families, how many empires in real history have been destroyed because their heirs tried to uphold a legacy that should have been left behind? This is the true weight of Fëanor's heritage, and in the end, it was all in vain. The Silmarils never returned to the hands of the Noldor. No son of Fëanor achieved the glory they sought. What remained were stories of pain, of betrayals, of brothers turning against each other and destroying what was left of their own race. Fëanor wanted to leave a legacy of greatness, but what he left behind was a warning that the obsession with power, pride, and revenge always comes at too high a price. And so, Fëanor's story came to an end. But the lessons it teaches still echo throughout Middle-earth and beyond. Because there will always be those who believe the world owes them something, who are willing to sacrifice everything for a cause that, in the end, might not even be worth it. Fëanor's story is a powerful warning about the dangers of obsession. He had the talent, the genius, and the courage to change the world, and he did. But the price was high. His unbridled ambition not only destroyed him, but dragged his people into a cycle of war, betrayal, and tragedy that echoed throughout Middle-earth. And this lesson isn't confined to Tolkien's mythology. How many times in real life do we see leaders, visionaries, and even ordinary people fall into the same traps? How many stories have we seen of empires destroyed by pride, of families torn apart by unthinking promises, of people sacrificing everything for a goal, only to discover, too late, that the price was too high? Do we sometimes pursue an ideal so relentlessly that we forget to ask if it's really worth it? Now think, how many decisions do you make based solely on your pride? How many times have you insisted on something just to avoid admitting you might be wrong? Fëanor's story isn't just about an elf and his sacred jewels. It's about how the desire for something can consume everything and everyone around us. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Middle-earth and want to keep exploring the most fascinating and profound stories of this universe, subscribe to the channel and hit the notifications bell. That way, you won't miss any content about Tolkien, his characters, and the secrets of the First Age. And now I want to know, in your opinion, was Fëanor a hero, an anti-hero, or a villain? Leave your comment and let's debate this epic story.